All right, folks. Today we're talking about sectional differences. This is 2.9, not to be confused with 2.7, which I believe was a very similarly titled set of notes. So we're going to talk about how the North and the South are getting slightly different here. That is our focus question, is essentially how did the North and South differ during the first half of the 1800s? The big reason we talk about this, and I'm trying to emphasize some of these differences, is because these differences eventually are going to pull the country apart. And in 1861, the North and South are officially fighting each other. So a lot of historians and a lot of students really look at this part of history in America and say, like, how could maybe small changes have been introduced to stop the differences from getting bigger? Um, I think it's really hard, and I don't want to throw in the towel, but like slavery is kind of the biggest issue. And if your proposals to try and end differences between North and South don't include slavery, then I think it still ends in civil war. Um, Lots of times people, I'll jump through these real quick, but lots of times people look at they look at slavery and they say, well, what if we never had a civil war? Would we still have slavery? And I think that is probably easy to answer. No, we wouldn't have had slavery if we didn't have a civil war, because if you look at like when a lot of other countries outlaw slavery, it is towards the end of the 1800s. So I think Brazil, for example, outlaws slavery sometime around 1890. Britain outlaws slavery in the 1830s, and America outlaws slavery in 1865. So, um, if you look at other countries around the world, you can kind of base maybe a historical projection on that. That is not to say that America would have definitely outlawed slavery, because there were a lot of people that really benefited from slavery, like this guy, Thomas Jefferson. So yeah, Jefferson's vision of America and the Democratic Republican vision of America is that everyone, and this is kind of his like wild prediction, which he is not very correct on. He believes that everyone in the future will own, you know, I don't want to throw a number out here because it's not exactly what he said, but he believes basically every American will own like 4 acres of land and will be a self-sufficient farmer. Um, Again, with more Americans living in the cities than ever before, Jefferson is not correct in that. Hamilton's prediction is a little more correct. Hamilton believes that America will become a city of, or America will become, kind of a network, connect the dots of cities with people living there. So there is kind of yeah, that kind of difference between those two guys as well. Jefferson's quote here is, "We must now place the manufacturer by the side of the agriculturalist. Shall we manufacture our own comforts, or go without them at the will of the foreign nation? He, therefore, who is now against domestic manufacturers, must be for reducing us to that dependence on that nation." So again, his focus is like trying to make sure we don't become just so industrialized that we forget about farming as well. You'll see a lot of pictures like this, especially once we get to the 1900s, because this is a photography from the early 1900s of child factories. The big photographer that did a lot of this work is Lewis Hine. You'll see his name again in Unit 5, I want to say, maybe 4, somewhere towards the end there. But what we're starting to see is differences between North and South. North having more factories, South having an increasing reliance on slavery. So um, yeah, as I said before, Jefferson wanted the United States to be a nation of farmers, but between 1815 and 1860, the industrial sector, especially in the North, especially in places like Philadelphia and New York City, Boston, eventually places like Pittsburgh and Cincinnati and Columbus and Detroit and all those places, would become hugely industrial. Okay. Why industrialization spreads. The tariff, first of all, we have an embargo that Jefferson puts in place. That shuts down our economy a little bit. And then at the end of the War of 1812, the British goods return and flood the US markets. So we're getting a little concerned that there's too many British goods here. So we have to kind of try and focus on making things in America. You can see things that say made in USA now. Typically, the things that are made in the United States today cost more, and that is because we have minimum wage laws in our country. Now, I'm not saying that as a bad thing or a negative thing. Certainly, there are people that want to get rid of minimum wage, but More to the point is that things that are made in China can be made without minimum wage. People work in factories, they make very little money to make the things that we buy and enjoy. But those same things made in America have to be made at a minimum cost of labor. So, why in the Northeast? Well, first of all, we've got this kind of access to capital to build factories. So, the starting of America is, you see wealthy families moving from England to the Northeast. A lot of the family or a lot of the people moving to the South at that time would have been indentured servants. And so, there's not the same injection of money basically at the starting point of our country. Um, the big cities in the north have been around and been industrialized for a while also already. So we have that kind of thing going for us, the factories in the north. Um, but a place like New York City is also somewhere that had been controlled by the Dutch, which were wealthy. They were wealthy trading and land speculating. And then the British purchased that. Another big thing here, southern land favored agriculture. If you go up north, you're going to see a lot more rocky environments, a lot worse soil. And so southern soil and southern landscapes definitely lead to more increased reliance on manual labor. Um, Places like New York City, there's not a lot of land in that area. There's actually a lot of waterways, which lends itself to people being shipbuilders or people using boats to trade. This is kind of something in historical circles called geographic determinism. Basically, the argument goes, if you grow up on a beach, you're more likely to be a professional surfer than if you grow up in, the cornfields of Iowa. Could you be a professional surfer born in Iowa? Absolutely. But your geography has a role in determining your future. So, the South having better land for agriculture means that it's more likely to have a reliance on a large labor force, which unfortunately means that slavery is going to be a little more relied on there. Um, the Northeast had a higher population, so with this increased number of people, you're also looking at cheap labor. This is kind of a snowball effect because the more people living in the Northeast, they're telling people from their home countries. A lot of these people in the Northeast are immigrants, recent immigrants. They're telling people in their home countries, "Hey, I'm using my hand as a phone here, but more likely this would be a letter. Hey, I just got a job working in a factory. It's nothing great, but I am able to make money and I have an apartment, and that is more than I had back in Ireland or Bavaria or wherever the heck, right?" And so these people were kind of spreading the gospel of the opportunities in America, even though they weren't super glamorous. They offered a way out. Okay. Um, so yeah, I mentioned this in the last section, but the industry, the more jobs there are, the less skill there is typically involved there. So skilled artisans suffered wage declines because if you were a blacksmith and you were making things out of iron, well, now there's a factory down the road that's able to produce a lot more iron goods a lot more cheaply. Tailors, people that were skilled at making clothes by hand, are now competing against mills that are making tons and tons and tons of clothes a lot cheaper. So those people are going to suffer. We do see some skilled workers kind of develop labor unions. This is a really early movement in America. To contrast this, what's going on in Britain at this time period is there's a group of people called the Luddites. And the Luddites are going into factories at the middle of the night and they're putting like wrenches and crowbars and all kinds of things in these machines. So then in the morning, when people go to turn the machines on, the machines just catch fire or explode and the factory shuts down. And the Luddites are super happy about this because they're destroying these sources of low wages, right? Oftentimes, the Luddites were skilled laborers who are now competing against this source of unskilled labor and these cheaper goods. And so the Luddites it's a short movement. It doesn't last forever, but now you'll hear people describe themselves as Luddites if they maybe don't have internet in their house or they have a flip phone or if they drive a car that is 40 years old or something. It's a term now for somebody who's a little bit out of time with technology. But Luddites were people that really resisted change. They resisted this new technology. Um, there's not really a ton of Luddites in America today. as far as like let's smash the computers or let's destroy electric cars or something like that. I don't really know the modern equivalent. Um, Lowell mill girls do go on strike in 1834 and 1836. So again, there's kind of this thing in like history where like, oh, people just accepted this and this is just how it was. But this is to point out that like these workers didn't just accept what they were doing. They were, trying to argue for better conditions and better pay and like time off. Can I get a holiday every once in a while kind of thing? And so these are the people that we have to thank for like modern day holidays, especially holidays like Labor Day. It's a day dedicated to the efforts of labor unions, and fighting for things like the 8-hour workday and workers' compensation and sick pay and those kinds of things. Um, Middle class people, this starts emerging, because typically you had people that owned the factories and then people that would work in the factories. Well, now you have people that are going to be middle management, or you might have the bankers that are going to finance some of these factories, lawyers as well. As we get increasingly complex with our economy, we're also going to get increasingly complex with laws. The more property that exists, the more people have property that could get stolen or could get damaged, and so that's going to increase an industry like law and attorneys. Um, okay, so factory workers could not afford to move and were in their neighborhoods segregated by race and class. This is going to persist pretty much, and I don't want to say until today because I don't have the numbers for that, but segregation in neighborhoods is still like a pretty big problem in this country, where we have not signs up that say people can't buy a house if they're white or black or Hispanic, but we see just data that tells us that there are pockets of different populations. So in some ways, things have not changed much since the 1820s. You can also see emigration from Ireland and Germany. Emigration is people leaving. So those people that are emigrants from those two countries are immigrants into the United States. 1830s, 600,000 immigrants, 1840s, 1.5 million, and the 1850s, 2.8 million. And so these are people that are coming over to find new work. One of the big reasons we have groups coming from Ireland is because of something called the Irish potato famine, which killed lots of people in Ireland. The people that were lucky enough to make it to America were able to come here, find jobs, obviously not die of starvation. But just to kind of explain this a little bit, like the potato, which originally is from North America, makes its way over to Europe in the Columbian Exchange in the 1500s. And because the potato gets to Ireland and other places in Europe, it doesn't necessarily have the same genetic resistance to fungus like a potato in North America would. And it's also exposed to different fungus. So it's just a complicated thing where like there's one strain of potato in all of Ireland. And if there's a fungus that gets into that potato crop, then basically the entire potato crop is going to die. This specific food, potatoes, was a staple as a primary food source for Irish people. I can't remember numbers now, but there was something I read that said like the average Irish person ate something like 4 pounds of potatoes a day or something like that, and so like the fact that this is now the primary source of food and it's not available to people is going to cause some problems. Um, Germany didn't necessarily have a potato famine, but people from Germany are escaping wars and complicated things in how German society is structured. There's lots of religious conflict in Germany between Catholics, Protestants, and as well as Ireland. Ireland is a predominantly Catholic nation. Southern Germany is predominantly Catholic as well. And so these people, were fleeing from religious persecution. And they said, well, America has a First Amendment that protects against religious freedom. So that seems like a great place for us. Um, yeah, so there's lots of people starving, and a lot of people go to other places as well, not just America. But you can see here, this is the impact of um, Irish ancestry is, and people kind of do these like 23andMe's or other kind of DNA test things, and they'll find Irish ancestry in them because mostly because of this potato famine. This is when Irish people are leaving Ireland. And so, some statistics you can see up here, but like nearly 25% of all Irish immigrants have settled in Australia, um, a place that is very far away from Ireland, culturally different, and the temperature in Australia is very different from Ireland as well. So, 1 in 4 adults in the UK are Irish or claim Irish ancestry, so a quarter of the UK, which is not very far away, but also it shows the impact of Ireland on that. Um, as I mentioned, Catholicism was kind of a big common trait between the Irish and Germans, but also there's lots of Jewish immigrants coming over at this time. As mentioned, Jewish immigrants would have faced persecution in the places in Europe they were. And not to make us sound like the bad guys here, but Jewish immigrants also faced persecution in the United States. There was also persecution of Irish people. So you would see these signs in stores that said help wanted, no Irish need apply. Sometimes in newspapers, people would post ads for jobs and it would say, you know, wanted dishwasher, and then it would say Nina underneath it. And Nina is the acronym for no Irish need apply, because you'd have to like pay for extra characters in a newspaper listing. They just put an acronym up there. So um, by 1860, which is kind of right at the onset of the Civil War, immigrants are 40% of New York's population. You can see that in New York City today. There's a huge amount of cultural pocketing in New York City. So you've got like Jamaica, Queens, you've got the Lower East Side, which is like Eastern European Jewish families. You've got a whole neighborhood called Little Italy. Then you've got a whole neighborhood called Nolito, which is like another little area of north of Little Italy. But you've got whole like cultural pockets. There's Chinatown in New York City as well, lest we forget that there's immigrants coming from other parts of the world as well. So anyway, yeah, there's a lot of discrimination between Irish Catholics and American Protestants. This leads to a whole like nativist movement, and nativist is a kind of a misleading term because nativists at this time were people who were born in America, but they're not Native Americans. So they're like second or third generation Americans, and what they're doing is discriminating against people that just got off a boat from Ireland. There's I I can't really talk about this without describing some irony, because like the people that came off the boat 40 or 50 years ago are now descendants, or their descendants are now discriminating against people coming off the boat now, right? And so there's this whole like they took our jobs kind of mentality here, or they're the whole like this Protestant Catholic thing is like Protestants see Catholics as following orders from a guy named the Pope, which they don't really follow orders, right? Catholics are just people that listen to the Pope. Um, and there's paranoia about that, and then also there's Protestant paranoia about there's a phrase called rum, Romanism, and ruin. And rum is liquor. So Irish and Germans, even to this day, get stereotyped as heavy drinkers. Um, Romanism is connection to Rome, which is where the Pope lives, and ruin, which is this idea that they're going to bring chaos into society. So those terms, Romanism, and ruin, were thrown around by these nativists to describe these Catholics coming into the city. I'm actually not going to show you this clip now because we're going to get to some other scenes later on in the 19th century that really hit here. But this is a great film if you need a film to watch. It's called Gangs of New York. You can see here Leonardo DiCaprio. It's got Daniel Day-Lewis. It's got Cameron Diaz. It's got John C. Reilly, I think, is in it. The guy from Step Brothers. Who else is in this? Um, there's another big character. In any case, there's a lot of good actors in it. It's definitely worth looking at. Okay, so moving away from the north, going down to the south, we can see here the U.S. slave population on this chart is maybe not exponentially, but definitely increasing at a faster rate over time. And that's because slavery became extremely profitable with the growth of cotton. Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin, and a lot of people in the North are like high-fiving, and they're like, yeah, Eli Whitney's going to be a saint because he's the guy that ends slavery. They were incredibly wrong about this because instead of ending slavery, the cotton gin just made it, easier for one slave to do the job of 10. So it didn't end slavery, it just made it more efficient. Um, and this is kind of a lesson in like technology doesn't really get rid of jobs, it just creates new jobs. So like the cotton gin replaced the jobs of those slaves, but now those slaves are forced to work harder hours picking more cotton. The profits that the efficiency from the cotton gin saw meant that slave owners could buy more slaves and buy more land. And so it's kind of this positive feedback loop of instead of ending slavery, it actually increases the reliance on slavery. You can see, that the effect of the cotton gin here, the growth of cotton went from 5 million pounds in 1793 to 170 million pounds in 1820. So there's a huge reliance on cotton because of the cotton gin. That video is just kind of showing you how the cotton gin worked, but essentially it's just a crank. It's got combs, pulls out the cotton bale from the spiky piece of the cotton, which people would, have their hands bleeding after picking cotton all day. So yeah, the stat here, 1840 Southern plantations grew 60% of all cotton used in America. That is, yeah, where we're going to see a lot of that reliance. Also, we're going to see reliance on cotton being an export. When we get into the Civil War, I'll mention this again, but one of the big strategies of the Confederacy was to actually try and get Britain to jump in on their side, and they were going to give Britain like a discounted rate on cotton. When Britain said no, the South was kind of without a lot of financial uh, help that they kind of relied on. So we're going to kind of see that importance. Also, you can see here the demand for slaves soared and slaves became more valuable. The big reason for this is because the slave trade was abolished. Not abolished from buying and selling slaves, but no new slaves could come in. So my analogy for this is like if you think about like a famous artist, while they're alive, their artwork is valued at a certain amount. But when that artist dies, all of their artwork increases in value because there's no new art that artist is going to produce. With ending slaves coming into the United States, immediately every slave that's here becomes instantly more valuable. And so you can see that effect as well. In 1802, a slave would cost $600. That same one slave price is 1800. It triples over those 60 years. And so that is going to fill the pockets of slave owners and slave traders in the South as well. It also increased the importance of slave catchers, people that would be, modern day, we would say the term bounty hunter, right? But these are people that are going into the North trying to catch slaves, and then they would come back into the South and say, look, I got your slave, so what's it worth to you? And they would get a reward for that. So, um, yeah, cotton limited development of land and resources. There's this kind of over reliance on cotton. It's also because monocrop agriculture, what we just talked about in Ireland, is actually pretty bad for the soil. Um, it's going to cause other problems. If you over produce cotton or overproduce any crop with the soil, you're robbing the soil of nutrients. Over time, you can't produce as much of it. And so it's kind of like too much of a good thing here for the South. They make a lot of money off of cotton, but it also is problematic. Um, so, just a stat here about New Orleans is the only large city in the South, and New Orleans is also a city that is under the sea level. This is just kind of highlighting to you that like southern cities really didn't develop because a lot of this land is going to be used for farming and slave agriculture. So you can see here the U.S. Census. We've got all free persons by square mile. And so you can see the deeper the purple here, the more free people you would see living in an area. You'll notice areas in the South don't have a ton of places like that. Some interesting pockets here in like Tennessee, and what this little purple dot is probably Atlanta, Georgia. Um, interesting to observe, but certainly, again, more of your pockets of purple are going to be in the Northeast here: New York City, Boston, coastlines, Philadelphia, New Jersey, etc. Um, so the North is getting more immigrants, the South is getting more reliant on slavery. Cultural consequences of this stuff is Southern white illiteracy was 15%. If you look at what the illiteracy rate between that people in the South who are white and people in the North and West who are white is, their illiteracy rate was 5%. And so, like, slavery is not just harming slaves and the people that are enslaved, but also those poor white families. They're not able to get an education because they have to compete with the slave plantation down the street. Um, Worth pointing out here that slavery had very few slaveholders. So this is kind of like a very upper crust of society kind of thing. Stats tell us that a quarter of white men had slaves in 1860. That is slavery at its peak, right? That is right before the Civil War. Three-quarters of these, so 25%, 75% of that 25%, owned fewer than 10 slaves. So if you're looking at a plantation of like 50 or 100 slaves, you're looking at the equivalent of somebody who is a multimillionaire today. These type of statistics show us that, like, a guy like Jefferson and a guy like Washington were some of the wealthiest men in America. As much as we talk about their, like, rise to fame and the hard work they put in, is they're given the privilege of being just incredibly wealthy. Um, 3,000 men owned 100 slaves or more. So again, it's a very small number to compare to some maybe like ideas that you've been presented in elementary and middle school. Typical slave owner lived in a farmhouse and had 4 to 5 slaves. So, everyone kind of focuses on these people that had like 100 and 200 slaves, but more of the average picture was kind of somebody who had 4 to 5 slaves. 4 to 5 slaves is still a lot of money to possess. And again, keep in mind that, like, the majority of white men in the South did not own slaves, right? So um, there's a lot of poor white men who don't have the same amount of resources as the plantation owner down the road. Um, the reason slavery stays propped up is because a lot of those men who don't own slaves look at it as a cultural or a social goal. They say, look, if I work hard enough, I work on this farm long enough, I make enough money, then one day I can crack into that, right? I can become one of these wealthy slave owners. Um, and then a lot of people also that own slaves said, like, well, I'm not going to free my slaves because they're going to seek revenge. And so there's, like, reasons why, even though people in this time period knew slavery to be wrong, they still defended it. Um, it's not as simple as, like, this is a wrong thing, so I'm instantly going to do something to end it. That's, if that was the case, then there'd be a lot of things today that maybe we would work harder to end, right? But it's, people get caught up in their lives. People get caught up in this whole, like, system of, like, status, right? If I'm a slave owner, I have this certain status in society. Um, Also, this whole concept of slavery gets this term necessary evil applied to it. That's in the beginning years. People say it's a necessary evil because, like, if you were a northerner who was wearing, like, a cotton shirt, then, like, it's really hard for you to speak out against slavery because you're wearing a byproduct of slaves. Like, someone in the South is going to be like, oh, you don't think slavery is good? Well, you can make your own shirt then, right? Like, you need to pick your own cotton. So it just is really hard for people to kind of, like, criticize from a moral perspective. But that perspective over time goes from slavery as a necessary evil to slavery as a positive good. Slave owners would do a lot of promoting of this idea that, like, oh, my slaves are better off for living on my plantation. I teach some of my slaves how to read. I teach some of my slaves how to write. That is not, like, really backed up with statistics. Slaves sometimes were taught to read and write, but, like, the conditions that they're placed under mean that it doesn't really matter. And so that's not really a huge benefit. I'm getting the little countdown on my recording here, so I'm going to jump